Toth has an abstraction that obviously as a kid, I never understood expressionistic artwork, Cubism and Van Gogh and all this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And now I can, and weirdly it's because of the comic book artists.
Hello, and welcome to Alex Toth In Depth. This is Paul Fricke, cartoonist, comics professor, and Toth advocate. This is the program where we discuss Toth's work and influence on comics, character design, and visual storytelling. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube or to the podcast. Positive reviews really help. Check show notes for links. For daily Toth art posts, follow Alex Toth In Depth on Instagram and spread the word. In discussion with us this episode is a comics creator who's done work for publishers big and small on titles like Powers, Bulletproof Monk, Mice Templar, Rapture, and many others. Out now or soon, he's got World of Krypton from DC, Blue Book on Substack, and his own project via his Patreon page. Welcome to a very busy guy, Micheal Avon Oeming.
Hey, Paul, thanks for having me, man.
Glad to have you. Thanks for joining us. Now, over the years, and every so often, I see certain artists' work, and I think, oh, they like Toth. And I'm positive I thought that the first time I saw your stuff. Was I onto something?
Yeah, absolutely. By the time my powers came along, I kind of went through these different phases artistically, a lot of creators do, a lot of artists. And earlier on, my work was super detailed, a lot more line heavy and such. Um, and through circumstances we can kind of get into, I had to simplify my style, and that's when my heart and mind really opened up and understood what Toth was doing. So by the time Powers came about, I was very, very Toth influenced, and that's those years where I was really in what I call Toth school, where I was just collecting everything and going to conventions for long boxes to track down every single issue of Hot Wheels, or
Right.
this weird issue of, he did so many fill-in short stories at DC,
Right.
whether in all the genres from romance to fantasy and the horror thing. So tracking down all those books was really fun, and yeah, he was a huge influence. He became a huge influence on me later, and like you, I now have this sort of Toth radar where I'm looking at people's line work, not how they draw, but how they ink,
Right.
and going, that's a Toth thing, and in a good way,
Right.
and I
Right.
feel like we're all sort of brothers and sisters in this Toth club of we get each other. We know why that thick, kind of chunky line is so much more beautiful than a highly rendered clip studio perfect brush, which are
Right.
also beautiful, but they're just different things, and they mean different things to different people. And yeah, when you see somebody else who has that love like that, you're like, I get you, dude or gal, you know?
Definitely. And you and I were doing the same thing before a lot of stuff was, well, before there was an online. I was going through those long boxes and checking out at comic shops and just digging up every stray Toth comic I could get and making my stack taller and taller.
Yeah, yeah. I do miss those days.
In some ways, yeah. In some ways, now I have my fingertips on potentially everything he's ever done. So collecting that stuff digitally
Yeah,
the last 20 years is also fine with me. So otherwise, there's a whole bunch
yeah.
of stuff he did in the 50s and 60s that are too expensive for me to buy now,
Sure.
if ever. And now I can see it all. I've been able to look into it and study it, and I wouldn't trade that for anything either. How many years were you working professionally before that started to click for you in terms of the line and simplification?
Probably a little over a decade. I broke in super, super early as an inker. I was like 14 when I got my first professional
Wow.
work,
Not
and I
far
think I was
from
probably
Toth's age
17.
when he broke in.
That's what I hear, yeah, or what a little bit that I read. And kind of, pre-digital age, like if you sent your work in, like nobody knew your age or anything like that. And at the time, I was sending out work to editors just to get feedback, and it was like kind of like a convention thing, right? Like I could send a letter with a self-addressed envelope and some of my samples, and then you'd hear back and you get critiques and stuff. And this one company just didn't know that I was a kid, So they started giving me work, and then I started getting regular inking work around the age of 17. Um,
Gotcha.
and while I was inking, I was getting jobs like there's this company called Innovation, and they did a bunch of um, a licensed book, and like the Chucky Child's Play franchise was one of them. So I was inking that for a very long time early on. And at the same time, starting to break into doing really independent stuff that I was getting to draw.
Mm-hmm.
There was like, porn parody comics or rock biography comics, and, that kind of thing that had a guaranteed audience, so that back then you could solicit it and you'd have enough orders at least to break even. It
Right.
was like a safety net to do certain topics. And at that time, I still wanted to be guys like Kevin Nolan, who was hugely influenced by Toth,
Right.
by the way.
No doubt.
And yeah, but I was looking at like the sharpness of his lines and the style, the contrast I was looking at, but I still didn't get like the kind of Toth angle of it. I was definitely an Art Adams child, like X-Men Annual 9 and New Mutants Annual 2, where they're like in Asgard. Totally formed all of my comic book sensibilities for a very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that time, I was very influenced by, yeah, like Michael Golden, Art Adams, Kevin Nolan, um, and just doing a lot of lines, like heavy line work stuff. And my career was going well, from slowly breaking in, not really making a living, but getting regular work, to eventually making a living at it. And I had my first kind of big breakthrough at DC with this project called Judge Dredd, and they got the rights for it. Um, and I wasn't really ready for the job. I was really in the right place at the right time, and I showed tons of potential. Um, but I still wasn't really ready for that level of work and responsibility. So I lasted like 4.5 issues or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then this guy J.H. Williams took over for me, and I don't know whatever became of J.H. Williams. Yeah, he's huge for people who don't know. So it's kind of cool to share some of my roots with him.
It's funny when you mentioned Kevin Nolan. I mean, when his first stuff started popping up in the back of Rocketeer, I thought that was, not heavily rendered, but more rendered. And when the toe thing
Mhm.
really came through to me with Nolan's stuff was on a Man Bat Secret Origin, and
Oh yeah,
you can
that's
see
like
Toth
legendary.
all
Yeah.
over that. Even in
Yep.
terms of the lettering and the balloons and everything. I've seen those originals and they're gorgeous. And and then I knew that I did the same thing I did with your stuff. I'm like, oh no, it's in the Toth.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And yeah, when you look at early Nolan stuff, he did tons and tons of like cross hatching, like it's which is very popular now, and it's all kind of comes from him, because it went from that kind of image style cross hatching, which was very um mechanical, and like
Mm-hmm.
so you could get these perfect kind of moire
Right,
fading effects and stuff, but he was doing this kind of scratchy cross rendering stuff, which now you see in everything, I think, because digitally it works so much easier, or so much better.
right,
But he was doing that way back when he was doing like Grimwood's Daughter, was
right.
like these backups in Dalgota. Yeah, and then when that Man Bat story came out, it kind of changed everything for a lot of artists. I was good friends with Adam Hughes. We were just one or two towns over from each other, and we're of similar age, and he's kind of like my big brother mentor. And I remember him looking at this Man Bat stuff and showing me, and immediately seeing this impact on Adam's work. And yeah, Adam's always one of these people who can take these influences and make them their own. You wouldn't necessarily look at like when you look at Adam Hughes' work, where he gets his heaviest Nolan influence from is what you'd call core lighting. When you've got that shadow in the middle of a body with light sources coming from both sides.
Right.
I remember him specifically giving me lessons about like core lighting and showing me the Man Bat story, and uh, also the shape of Nolan's. I know this is a Toth podcast, but
No, no, go
the
ahead.
shape of Nolan's like lines and simplicity. Like he would create these contours in the shadows
Yep.
that didn't really go with the contour of the body, but it went with the contour of, say, the composition or the eye flow.
Absolutely. Yep.
So it became this extra level of, it wasn't just good rendering, it was expressionistic rendering. um, and again, a lot of that does also go back to Toth. As I was preparing for this and looking through some of Toth's work, I forget how many different styles he has, rendering styles.
Yep.
And he would do this one particular look, which was very dead flat line
Hmm.
with heavy blacks. So not like that thin line and then the thick line that we know Toth for so well, but like a single monochrome line and then just black shades. And I was looking at that, I was like, oh wow, this is where Kevin really got a lot of his inner fire from. I'm sure there's other influences, of course,
Absolutely.
right?
It,
So kind of getting back to how I ended up here was after a lot of ups and downs in the industry. My son was born in '94, and that's around when we had that mid '90s collapse of everything, and
right.
like jobs started going away, companies were going out of business. It was hard to just find work and stuff, and I found myself in a position where I just couldn't get enough work for hire. And I even shifted back to being more of an inker on stuff. And I was inking Neil Vogts on Ninjak with Kurt Busiek for Valiant back in the day. And we did
Hmm.
that for like 2 years. But the work just dried up and I had to get a regular job, you know, to bring in some money because I had this kid now, right?
Right.
So I find a job where I can draw, which is a security guard at this like auction place in New Jersey called Nade, and I'd sit in this little booth and check in cars when they were coming in to be auctioned off, and in between just draw stuff. And it was the worst and best thing that could happen for me because it was bad because I was on this upward trajectory in my young career, right? And it all makes sense. You do this, you get that. You get your foot in, you get your leg in, you're in. It doesn't really work that way. You know, it's a constant audition. Even after you've become a known commodity or whatever, it's a
Mm.
constant audition. Um, and so it was demoralizing. You know, I wasn't bringing in the money, and my son was born, and it's just this felt horrible. It felt like I was being rejected, and like my work wasn't good enough, and all of this stuff.
Right.
And then through this process, though, it was the best thing because one of the first things I realized was, you know what, I don't need to be drawing Judge Dredd for DC and being flown to conventions or store appearances to feel like I'm a comic book artist. I was putting the carriage before the horse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I realized, you know what? Even if I'm not, quote, making it the way I thought I was going to make it, there's no reason I can't keep making comics and just for myself, even if there's only one or two a year, right?
Hmm.
Like that's where I realized what it really meant to be dedicated and to really love what I was doing. So with that thought process, I was also like, well, I don't have the time to spend at the desk as much because I have a son and a job now. So
Hmm.
how do I strip back what I'm doing? How do I make it go a little faster without really sacrificing anything? And at that same time, when I was losing all that work and trying to get work, one of the jobs I was trying to get was on like the Batman Adventures stuff.
Right.
So I did a bunch of stuff in that style, which I didn't fully understand, which was a blessing again because if I got those works, I would be doing full on model Batman Adventures, Bruce Timm, exact kind of stuff.
Right.
But instead, because I kind of did the style, but not really, I was able to take that influence and truly make it mine. And that's
Hmm.
when things changed. That's when people started seeing the simplified style and connecting to it in a way that they didn't connect to my other work. And it was during this time period where I met Brian Bendis and David Mack, and we started talking about creator-owned comics and stuff. And while I'd already done some creator-owned comics, it didn't really sink in my head exactly what it was. And it was through meeting them and talking to them about stuff. Powers came about, and that's where everything changed. New direction. Long story short, sometimes you have to take 3 steps back to make any progression forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where I found Toth. That's where I started to understand through my love of Bruce Timm, understanding Toth, which also opened up my doorways to like understanding John Buscema, who his work was always I'm going to get crucified for it, but it was just this boring Marvel house style because it had been imitated so many times and so watered down that when I was looking at John Buscema, I couldn't tell the difference between John Buscema and the other stuff that was you know, just doing his style.
Right.
But through Toth, through Toth and Tim and this new understanding, I started to understand his work in a completely different way. And the same thing with um, Joe Kubert. Um, so sometimes you need one artist to understand this one way of getting into the work to see and appreciate other things. So this step backwards and having to strip back everything, the less is more thing
Mm-hmm.
really blew my mind and changed my whole game and stuff. And that's when I was leaning heavily on like Toth and Tim were my targets for quite a while.
That's an interesting evolution. For me, it was around the same amount of time, like 7 to 10 years, where Toth was my
Mm,
favorite for sure. But I wasn't always
yeah.
applying it to the work. I felt like I had to prove I could draw. The cross hatching thing was a
Mm,
big deal
yeah.
black and white indie comics during that time. And it took some
Yeah.
time for me to simplify it down or to get the guts to let it fly the way I wanted it to be.
I like that you said it does take guts. It takes guts, because
There's nowhere to hide.
you know exactly, exactly. I spent a lot of time redrawing faces because they're slightly wobbly or slightly offhand, and I can't hide it in the line work.
Right.
Um, the amount of time you spend taking stuff out is almost the amount of time I spend putting stuff in.
Hmm.
you know, and then yeah, they kind of have to be perfect because it really shows through. Which is why I have such an appreciation of guys like Chris Samney. Like
Right.
strip away all the style in his inking, it's just solid
The
drawing.
structure is
Art
there.
Adams the same way.
Yeah, and when you're mentioning those earlier artists, it sounds to me like the structure of objects and figures and the structure of panels and composition, Buscema Kubert, were coming through to you uh, after looking at Toe stuff and Tim's stuff,
Yeah,
more than just the surface stuff. So if I'm looking at your stuff, the first thing that popped out to me was the black spotting, and that's a very surface level similarity to Toth's work. But the way you're
sure.
describing it is that there's something more underneath that you appreciate and applied and do
Yeah.
apply.
Yeah, Toth has an abstraction that obviously as a kid, I never understood expressionistic artwork, Cubism and Van Gogh and all this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And now I can, and weirdly it's because of the comic book artists, like understanding that like sometimes Toth will lay down shadows, not well, both Toth and Mignola, but especially Mignola, they'll lay down shadows that don't logically make sense,
Hmm.
but they emotionally make sense, or
Yep.
they make sense as in carrying the eye from one place to the other, or saying something about the form that even the form isn't saying something about the page that even the page isn't saying. Sometimes when Toth would play around with panels, like at angles or doing something extra thick, um, he was not doing some tricky panel thing because it was a trick. He was using the panel to help express the action or emotion inside of the panel.
Right.
Like right now, I'm looking at a page of his famous Black Canary story,
Yep.
and it's page 6 where there's these little panels of her, you know, kicking somebody around judo style, and there's two panels where the edges are at a 45-degree angle,
Hmm.
and they're not lined up with each other, so that gives a sense of being disjointed, but also a sense of those angles subconsciously are knives or violence. When you give like a triangle, it's when your eye comes to a point, it creates like almost this like visual accident or an impact or something.
Right.
So where the other panels have just square panels, there's two of them with these kind of triangular shapes to it that gives those panels more impact. So even in choosing his panel shapes, he's expressing a thought or an emotion that comes from him to the reader that has nothing to do with straightforward storytelling or
Right.
straightforward rendering.
Right.
It's amazing.
That's graphic design getting a feel and movement across.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the other thing. It says graphic design is something that at best I can imitate, but I can't get anywhere near. He was light
Well,
years ahead of anybody. It's insane.
we can keep trying, I guess. when when
Even his lettering.
well, no doubt. He is my favorite letterer too.
Yeah. Yep.
He can have it all.
Yeah.
Chiarello and I were when we were talking about this. It's like, maybe he's just for me. Maybe he was just best
That
at
was a
everything.
yeah. That was a great interview too.
Thanks.
Yeah. That was really good.
So when you're applying the stuff you're taking in and learning from Toth and others, when and how does it become your own? Did you feel like when that was happening, it was already all your own and you were finding your own way? Because you've got this thing where it's not as naturalistic as what Toth would often put down in terms of his figure work, let's say. But somebody who's also
Mhm.
influenced by a Toth like Phil Hester, you guys do that thing where you're doing kind of this angular exaggeration within
Yeah.
your figures. And that seems like it's like of a piece when that clicked for you. uh, how, how much of that did you just come upon? How much of that is purposeful, or does it just happen?
I think there's kind of three fronts to it, and
Yep.
it's a great question. I've never thought about this before or anything. One is like from a just a fanboy place.
Yeah.
Uh, Brian Stelfreeze was a big influence on me.
Hmm.
You know, and you look at his lines; they almost all look like little black knives or razor blades that are just spread out on the page.
Right.
And Mignola is obviously another one. And whereas Mike didn't use that kind of line work, he would use a flat line, but there was all these jagged edges to them. And what I found that I love about those jagged edges is that again they help express the shape. Like say an arm where you would typically have this kind of C shape, he would come to a corner in the middle of it. It's a very subtle little corner, and what that does is it creates this like this energy pop, like kind of like I was talking about with those panels. You know, like your eye stops there for like half a second,
Hmm.
and it just emphasizes the angle of that arm. So that was part of it. The other answer, to be completely honest, was I was just never good enough to imitate the people that I really loved. So there were times I was totally doing my best to do Alex Toth. One example of that is I did a book called Alistair and Adolf, and it was
Hmm.
about Alistair Crowley, who was supposedly actually working against the Nazis to create false occult readings that the Nazis were using in their plans and stuff because they were fucking nuts, right?
Right. Right.
So they used one crazy occult thing against this other crazy occult thing. It's real stuff. It was crazy. But the main character in there, I just wanted to draw a Toth face. I literally said, I'm just going to draw a Toth face. And I even create all these files with these Alex Toth faces and stuff. And you can kind of see it in the book, but it's still miles away from what I wanted to hit, which was just this total obvious homage. And I still couldn't do it.
Right. Right.
Um, so some of it is the influence, and some of it is just my lack of being able to get there. Create accidentally creates its own unique style.
I get you, and I've aborted projects before
Okay.
because I've had Toth too much on my shoulder. I was just trying to hit that. I'm like, all
Mm.
right, cut that out. draw like draw like
I'm like
yourself.
that with Mignola. Like, yeah, I'm like that with Mignola. There's times where I've questioned. I was like, "Ah, I think I've gone too far. Um, you know, and now I've just become comfortable with with whatever. You know.
Whatever you're doing. So you mentioned in regards to black spotting that the Nolan Man Bat story and how he was carving out shapes within the silhouettes was instructive. But I've seen
Mm,
videos that you've posted online of your black spotting process. Well, now it's all about. I mean, you're doing it digitally. You're using the paint bucket, but you go back and forth when you're doing that, and you're adding some, you're taking stuff out. So I guess my question is, how do you go about? What's your approach for putting black areas in your work, and how much of that is pre-planned, and then how much is instinct as you're working?
I think it's fair to say a lot of it is instinct. Most of what I do is more instinctive. Um, I wish I was more technical. I really admire people who have a process and then they know exactly how they're going to attack something before they do.
Right.
Um, and it's not that my instincts are always right. Sometimes they're totally wrong, but it's just the natural place for me. I notice when I overthink something, um, it's not as good.
Hmm.
In fact, I've had really big opportunities on certain books, and sometimes I just froze up because I was just trying so hard
Right.
instead of just letting mistakes be mistakes and not overthinking things by going with a gut feeling. Like sometimes those panel borders that I was talking about, it's more of a feeling that I can't really put into words or express.
Right. It looks
Um,
right. It feels
when
right. So you do it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of instinctive moves. Early on, the way I started with my black spotting, this is pre-digital, and just really quick. Largely, the reason I work digitally, most part now, is just eyesight stuff. The eye
Oh.
strain. Sometimes I will wake up with just huge headaches. I'm constantly putting eye drops in my head. I have blue blocker glasses with other things on top of it, like it's a whole
No,
thing that happens,
yeah,
when
sorry.
you've been drawing for 20 years. Um, but early on, the way I found my black spotting was I was using a light box. So I draw on like, I lay the page out or pencil it pretty tightly, but as like tight layouts on like photocopy paper. Then I would take either a brush or a marker or whatever and spot my blacks that way. So I spent like a whole pass just thinking about the black spotting.
Right.
After doing that for 10 years or so, I already knew the moves before I made them,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure as an inker, the same thing. Like you look at a page, you don't have to practice anything. You know what's going to happen
Yep.
because of your experience.
Yep.
So that's where I am now. I draw the pages; they're all open, and then I do the whether I'm working analog, like on Project Blue Book, or digitally. I'm just going. I'm figuring out as I go, and there's a mood like in Blue Book. It's super black. It's super dark because it happens at night, and it's in the woods. So automatically, there's just super huge amounts of black. World of Krypton doesn't lend itself to being a noir thing through the whole story. So while I'm using a lot of black, I'm not using it. I'm using it more to balance the page out as opposed to using shadows and stuff. So there is a different digital approach than an analog approach. One of the most fun things about working digitally when it's spotting blacks is sometimes I'll just create another layer over the things that I already thought that I have and just start dropping the paint bucket to see how far I can push it.
Right.
Because on this other layer, I can lower the opacity and choose, oh, this looks great now, but I've kind of lost the side of the face because there's too much black, and now you can't tell where this body ends and the blackness starts. So I can just erase some of it and then drop that black layer back down. So it's a way of playing around with the blacks without taking any chances or anything. And I love both. I love the analog thing of just figuring it out and letting things happen when they happen. And still, if you make a mistake with the digital world, you can clean it up or fix it afterwards. It is my favorite part.
It's a lot of students are very trepidatious about putting black areas down on pages, I find. And some of
Sure.
that is because of the high contrast, or if something goes wrong, and it can go wrong easily, then it's all screwed up. So people are very worried about putting down. What I often advise students to do is to take your page or your pencil, and reduce it down, and then do very similar to what you did. You get a big black
Yeah.
marker and just try a few different attempts or approaches to putting that down there. Test it out, right? Do these little guides, these little
Yeah.
studies, to see what'll work. Give you a guidepost to when you're doing the final.
Yeah. There's no reason to be afraid because well, the other thing you have to be afraid, I would say, of is just time. Depending on your deadlines. Like, do you have the time to take that page and test out a black on it or something?
Right.
It all depends on your deadlines. But there's really nothing to lose because even if you screw up an original piece, it sucks, but we now have a digital approach where we can clean stuff up or fix it. God forbid you spill ink on a
Oh,
page.
geez,
It
I've
used
done
to be
that
you'd
many
have to
times.
cut that section of the page out or something.
Yeah, it's funny with Toth too. It's like in some pages that I've been able to dig out a few um, where it's partially inked, and he's not attacking the page you would expect. He's not doing line work first. He's kind of sculpting around it. He's doing like eyes and then black areas and then doing
Ah,
line around
yeah.
it. And it's just not what I would expect at all. um and some I'm not sure how he's doing that or why, but it's very intriguing. The other thing too is we we have some, if you study some of his pages, you can see all the underdrawing and structure. And then when he
Yeah.
goes to put the black in, he puts in more than he originally intended. um,
Yeah.
so if you're looking at
Yeah.
a Milt Caniff process of like Steve Canyon, early Steve Canyon page, he'll put all the line work in first and the lettering, right? And then it's all step by step, and he's building it, and he's kind of like just trusting that he'll know when he's putting the black and the chiaroscuro thing over the top, he'll be able to do it. It was just part of the process. Toth does that, but there's a level of design and how far he pushes it that's beyond, I think, what Kniff was doing in some cases anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I remember Dave Johnson gave me advice
Hmm.
about just trying to make half of the page black. And not in the sense of like you're trying to do Alex Toth, but because black gives balance to a page, even when there's color coming. So that doesn't mean literally every page has to be 50% black, but if you think of it that way,
Hmm.
um, it really helps give just weight to the page. And I got to the point where between what Dave said to me and my other studies and like looking at Kirby as well, he makes like try to make every object 50% half white, half black.
Hmm.
And it gives so much weight to it. And there's different ways of going about that. When I know I'm going to lay down a lot of black, I won't really draw all those details. But guys like Toth and Kniff and Mignola pencils everything. Like for Mike with all the black on his page, when you look at his pencils, it's almost like a Jeff Darrow thing. I mean, not to that crazy level of detail, but
Right.
like literally every object is drawn, even if it gets completely covered up in black, or even if you only see that corner of it. Um, that amazes me because that just takes that confidence to draw something beautiful and then cover it up. You know.
Yeah, there's a short story Toth did, called Dirty Job. And the
Hmm.
last page is the three crosses, the crucifixion. And when he was drawing it, I think he
Yeah.
drew everything out, and then he said, oh, screw it, he blacked the whole thing out. It was more powerful as silhouette,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean he didn't do the perspective and the underdrawing first.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah. And that is one of my favorite stories. It's just so strong and powerful. It's crazy.
But as much as he must have planned the black, but he also relied on his instincts later on, and did that where he left room to improvise and push it further. So I
Yeah.
guess you get an instinct for that too, the more you do it.
Yeah, to the point that it gets in the way of other stuff. Like on HBO, it's a detective show. It's a reboot, Perry Mason.
Oh yeah.
And I'm watching it and I'm going, I just want to turn the color off, and bump up the contrast. I'm like, because it was so Toth like so heavy in its blacks and shadows, but I felt like the color was ruining it. Um, so that's the level like where I'm always thinking. I'm just always thinking about them. I'm always thinking about light and shadow and stuff. Even playing video games, which I don't do a ton of, but when I do, I'm constantly looking at accidental compositions that happen as you're running around a game or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah.
It just takes over your mind, and I think it's a good thing, though.
Yeah, I can't shut that off too. I try to read comics faster just so I don't get bogged down analyzing it as I go. The
Oh man, I have a problem where when I'm reading a good comic, it's hard for me to finish because I get excited and I want to like take that excitement and hit the page or start writing a different idea.
Right, right. Now you mentioned with both Mignola and Toth um, that they're pushing the blacks so far, but you're right, and Dave Johnson's right. The colors then are the midtone, right? So when Toth is preparing his
Mhm.
work, to be colored and usually poorly, it holds up because the design and the black spotting is there. So, but like
Yeah,
JP Leone said when I spoke with him, he prefers looking at toe stuff in black and white than when with the color, even though that he designed it in that with that in
sure.
mind. Very similar to your reaction to watching the Perry Mason show.
I've done that. I didn't realize, but I've done that a couple times where I was being colored by somebody who I wasn't familiar with the colorist, like some work for hire stuff.
Hmm.
And I would purposely just lay down as much black as possible so that, because I'm spoiled. I'm used to working with like two or three colors for like the last 20 years or
Right.
something. It's Nick Filardi and Taki, really
Hmm.
just two people. So anytime I work with somebody else, I'll typically lay down extra black so that I just know there's less chances for something gaudy to happen, or if they're using a technique I don't like,
Right. Yeah.
there'll be less opportunity for it because everything is in black.
No doubt. In the early 80s, I saw Bill Sienkiewicz on a panel once, and he said, and again, this was a time when comics were not traditionally well colored. He said that he drew all his pages just assuming everything would be colored orange.
Oh, I love that guy. He's
It's a
so
fail
brilliant.
safe. So now, on a
Yeah.
personal question, Micheal Avon Oeming, why Avon?
That is my legal middle name, which
Gotcha.
as you can imagine, a child of the '70s, I did not tell a lot of people, especially because back then there was the door-to-door Avon salesman, so the joke was always Avon calling.
Yeah, yeah,
It didn't
I'm
hurt me or
partial to it
anything,
because my
but
mom was an Avon lady, so,
there you go.
you got
Well,
me.
you hear a certain joke so many times, it's not worth hearing again, is all.
Yeah, I gotcha.
So I hid that for a long time. But when I started, Oeming is an odd name and it's not easy to remember. And signing it always felt like every time I signed my art, I felt like I was signing a check, not because I was getting paid, but because I used the same signature, you know.
Uh-huh.
And Avon, I was, again, my buddy Adam Hughes, who is a big brother mentor to me, also introduced me a lot of the geek love that I have. And one of those things was this old British sci-fi show called Blake Seven, which
Mhm.
was like the Doctor Who kind of stuff, but with space pirates. And there was this really badass character named Avon, and I was like, "Oh, that's cool." And then he was like, "Yeah, if I was you, I would start using Avon." So I started using because it was easier to remember, cooler looking to sign because it's all these little zigzags,
Right.
and yeah, that's why I started using Avon.
You embraced it, and then it's self-actualization.
Yeah, now it's just these big ass jokes about how who has a bigger ego, me or Brian Michael Bendis. So it's Micheal Avon Oeming, Brian Michael Bendis, just trying to take up all the space on a page.
You're like Doogie Howser, Neil Patrick Harris. Everybody knows that people with
There
3
you go.
names or 1 name are better than the rest.
Yeah, or serial killers. So,
Well
but
well, there you go, good company. Now, we're go back to, Powers when things started clicking for you. I'm really intrigued by how you've navigated, career. Um, there things we've talked a little bit about breaking in, and breaking in now is different from when you and I did. But
yeah,
you've done work for big companies, so you've done work for hire, you've done creator-owned stuff from at least fairly early on, and then you've had projects licensed and made into movies or TV. How does that all work? How much of that is purposeful, and you go for that, and how much do you just ride, and how do you balance it?
I mean the film TV stuff is purposeful. Like it's something we're always working at. One of the reasons for that is to be honest, is like it's not the artistic vision of wanting to see your stuff on the screen.
Hmm.
Like I want that to happen too, but let's be honest, you're not going to retire off of making comics.
Right.
Like at best, you can stay out of debt. Like that's sort of month to month. Like we do well, but most of my money and time is spent on making sure we never have debt. Um, and comics pay well, and sometimes they don't. And when you're making creator owned stuff, you're taking a giant chance. Typically, it's all royalty based with no advance. So I've done projects where I've spent 6 months on it and made like $2,000 or something, for a lot of work. Um, so part of like the film and television stuff is purposeful because I need that to you know help with when I eventually retire.
Right.
Let's face it, I'm not going to be able to draw all the time, and even if I'm able to draw till I'm 90, who knows if people will want to see that at a certain point.
Hmm.
And it's not a diss on me or anything. We've seen careers go that way with people who are perfectly talented and still can draw, but for whatever reason either fall out of favor or you're just thought of as just being around or whatever. So long story short, the film TV stuff is purposeful because it has very practical reasons.
Well, you're talking about multiple streams of income and having different and bigger income to, for stability and to make sure you can keep doing it and retire all right.
Yeah, I mean, I left comics, not completely, but in like 2009, I went to work at a video game company called Valve, and
Hmm.
it was a great experience. And one of the reasons was, besides being paid well, you also had like health insurance and vacations, two things you don't get in comics.
Right.
And I worked there for about 3 years. I was making comics for their video games, like on their website and stuff.
Hmm.
And I learned work digitally there. Met all these other artists. The owner is an amazing person, but I became like a functional alcoholic working there. I just wasn't happy because I love comics that much that job stability wasn't enough to keep me away from it. Um, so while it sounds a little crass, we talking about like film in Hollywood as this very practical thing to so you can make a living or retire, like that's how much I love comics. Is that I could have continued working in video games and stuff, but this is where I want to be. And it's just not an easy place to make a living, even when you're successful.
Yeah, and that's after doing comics for about 10 years, I flipped the script and started doing
Yeah.
illustration and comics out of the industry and doing storyboard work. And there were people within the comics industry who thought I was selling out, and I'm like, well, I've got a family starting here, and I wasn't as fulfilled
Yeah.
doing the comic book work as I thought it would be, and the kind of comics I wanted to do, I knew weren't going to pay the bills. So
Yeah.
it felt very comfortable for me, but I've always kept comics in the mix, and now all I want to do is talk about, teach, and draw comics. It's what I've always wanted to
That's
do,
awesome.
but I'm at a place where I can kind of focus on that a little bit more. Several years ago, I just want to broaden out to the comics industry and changes that are happening. Several years ago, I thought that traditional comics, the monthly comics, the floppies that people call them now, would recede, and I found myself not buying as many monthly comics because the price point uh, for was too high, and I thought it was
Yeah.
a natural that digital comics would give people their fix, right, without the price point too high. Now, to
Yeah.
me, that means the digital price point has to be a little lower, perhaps,
It
than
should
they've
be. Yeah.
been. You would think, right, just because you're not creating that physical product. But I was wrong
Yeah.
because people held on to it, and the digital was just about overtaking, printed monthly comic sales, and then backed off. They were kind of even for a while, but now it seems to finally be happening, and no doubt the process has been sped up due to the pandemic. And
Yeah.
there's a variety of different ways. It's almost like there's like 10 different comics industries now, and
Yeah.
and there's a variety of ways people can do their own comics, right? They can just do DIY and print zines, or they can do mini comics, or they can publish online or do web comics. You've done Kickstarter stuff, you've got a Patreon, and then Substack is a big deal now, right? Because it's, to me, another way. It's a different delivery system, and it's another way for people to get that fix. Where everything I've read, you would intend to collect these uh, in print later on.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to all that? Does are you thinking? It sounds to me like you've been thinking about this stuff, how to apply, how to either push that or assess it and adapt to it. Um, how do you navigate all that?
Yeah. I mean, there's so I agree with you on everything you said there. You know, that watching the industry change has been it's pretty incredible. One narrative we all hear, and I want to say this to any possible younger readers too, is you always hear about comics are dying. I have heard this back in like '86 or something when I first broke in.
Right,
You
Neil
know,
Adams predicted comics would be dead in 5 years in the early '70s.
yeah, yeah. And then later, in like it was right after I was struggling after Judge Dredd, and there was an editor at DC who had taken me under his wing, and he was telling me this in the most big brotherly kind of looking out for me kind of way.
Hmm.
He told me to get out, you know, and we were at a diner across from DC offices. It was this diner that was like a '50s style diner, and at the counter they had like all this like retro stuff, including comics that were from the '50s or whatever. And he was like, Mike, this, you know why they're showing these and they're not showing new Batman? It's because comics are a thing of the past. um he knew I had a kid coming and stuff, and he was like, just find another way to make a living. It's like, it's not you, it's the industry. It just sucks and it's going to
Hmm.
die.
Hmm.
So that was like '93 or something.
Right.
So even this past year during the pandemic,
Hmm.
companies had pencil down orders. Diamond wasn't shipping stuff. I That's when I really thought it was over. I was like, the distribution system we have is like a three-legged table, and we just lost one of the legs. This is going to collapse.
Right.
Um, and it didn't. In fact, comics are doing better now than they were pre-pandemic.
Right.
Um, and it's fascinating, and it's encouraging, and we're now in a position where Diamond doesn't have quite the stranglehold that it used to. There are so many more ways to get your comics out. There's so many ways to get them distributed, whether you're talking traditional or digital. The fact that I can do on Kickstarter, my After Realm comics is a fantasy comic.
Mm-hmm.
I had been working on them back in like 2012 or so. I have a tendency to just work on a project when I'm passionate and then figure out how to release it later.
Good.
Unfortunately, that has a bad side effect sometimes. You can have a bubble, and there was this huge fantasy bubble that happened before I got After Realm to come out. So kind of the only life place for it was a place like Kickstarter.
Hmm.
And it was beautiful to be able to do a comic, not worry about how it was going to be distributed, not be afraid of like our publisher's going to say yes or no, and not care how many people are going to actually read it, like mass wise.
Right.
Like, because if we only have like 300 people reading it, they're all reading it. It's not like they go to those 300 copies go to a store, some get sold, some don't. They're all hardcore readers. So
Mm-hmm.
that was this amazing experience. And then with Substack, doing a book like Blue Book, like it just wouldn't be possible in your regular direct market book distribution. Like there's just not enough of an audience for it,
Right.
especially in the style that we're telling it, which is a straightforward retelling of Blue Book cases, where the only thing we're adding to it is our narrative flair, like how we show their emotions and stuff. But we're not adding or subtracting any facts as much as possible.
Well, that's almost like the true life crime thing that's popular now, right? It's a similar hook or approach.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what's wonderful, and hopefully the rest of the industry will take notice of what Substack is doing as far as giving authors and creators um, good enough pay to be able to do this kind of work. You know, one of the reasons I work on multiple projects is because it's just hard to pay bills, and a lot of us get frustrated when there are companies that literally make billion-dollar films and none of that really comes back to the industry. It doesn't come back to the artist. It doesn't come back to the publishers. Um, and so being treated decently goes a long way. There are other issues with Substack and stuff, but that's the digital world now. There's it's tough out there to find a perfect place for anything. But creatively, it's given us this opportunity, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad that's come about. It's in line with what I've been thinking for several years now. It's just one way to solve that. I'm really curious to see how that experiment works out, and I'm glad it's working out for you.
Yeah, my hope for it is that like I don't know what all the other creators are doing. I know a lot of them are going to concentrate on their audience to bring their audience with them.
Right.
But I'm hoping a lot of people will think kind of along the lines of this, which is James Tinney and I. Not only do we love this subject, but I feel like you don't need to be a superhero comic book reader to read this stuff. Like this can grab your average citizen who's kind of interested in these sort of stories, but it doesn't. It's not heavy in the comic book genre, you
Right.
know, which is why comics are more popular in other parts of the world because they'll tell just life stories and stuff. That's why the graphic novels do so much better because a lot of times they're life things that people can um, relate to, as opposed to one of my even powers, which is like superheroes and people shooting each other and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like to be able to have a book that's based on true life stories, I think those have a wider appeal than we realize.
I would hope, and we're seeing more and more of that happen. I'm sure, for a variety of reasons, Western comics were stunted in the last few decades. The last decade, again, uh, it's evolving more and more is available. And like you say, comic sales, although dwarfed by movie and video game sales annually here, they're holding their own or growing, and hopefully people to me, even though comics were stressed as a visual medium for decades now, I've been thinking comics first and foremost as a reading medium, and it seems like we're reaching people who are readers first. Um,
Yeah.
on Blue Book, so your visual uh, approach to this, is this influenced by Toth, how you're going about it, and then how you're using color or tone in it as well? It's a really clean a nice look, and the story's told very well.
Thank you. Um, yeah, it's definitely my most tothiest of stuff. I was looking for a project where that was less drawing intensive than my typical stuff, and by that I mean you have superheroes flying through a city and crashing through a building. That's a lot of drawing.
Right.
Even in like powers and stuff, there's a lot of drawings of huge crowd scenes and cityscapes and traffic jams and all this kind of stuff. And I was looking for something smaller in scale, where I could work analog, where without all that detail, I wouldn't have the eye stress and issues that come along with drawing those kinds of scenes. And occasionally in Blue Book, yeah, we're going to have crowd scenes, like press release scenes, that kind of stuff, right? But for the most part, I was like, okay, this is something I can bust out the brushes again, use real ink again. Um, and while I'm not looking at Toth, clearly all of the influence from there is coming through in this project, and it's that it just feels right to go that way. Whereas like the Krypton thing I'm doing is not very Tothy at all.
What's the look
But
of
this is
that?
like I'm laying down. I'm drawing that all digitally, so there's tons of layers of like zipatone and backgrounds being separated from foregrounds and special objects that are floating in the air that are connected to a body but not part of it and stuff. And considering what the colorist needs to make it easier on him.
Right.
And it's a much thinner, finer, sharper line.
Got it.
A lot more detail. And it doesn't call for shadows so much.
I hear you. In Blue Book, it looks like you're using not only the black and the art and the line work, but then maybe three shades of blue, and then a red spot color occasionally.
So I'm using uh, yeah, that's the part that comes digitally is coloring in with blue. Obviously, it's called Blue Book, and James had the idea to want to do it just in the monochrome color, which is something I've always wanted to do.
Yeah.
So this was perfect reason to do it. And initially, I was only going to use one shade of blue, and then I realized how much more depth I can get out with two shades of blue. And then I realized as the process went on, I was telling the story because most of the audience hopefully will be non-fans of mine, meaning
Mm-hmm.
most of the I'm hoping we pick up people who are interested in the subject, not just my quote readers or fans or
Right. Right.
whatever. So I
Right.
want to make the storytelling easy for anybody to come in. So that means very straight on forward shots and easy panels.
Mm-hmm.
But what that does is that creates this rhythm of a kind of calmness and sameness that then I can then ramp up the mood when something weird happens, add in a little bit of texture that wasn't on the calm pages, a third shade of blue to give it more um, depth and stuff. And then there will be one or two other spot colors that happen in just these right moods as a special effect. Or like when you watch a film
Right.
and somebody's being followed, suddenly the camera goes from a lot of like eye shots and mid shots and stuff we're used to seeing, say you're being followed, so you see shots through a window, you see shots through a tree.
Right.
The camera goes on an angle to let you know something's a little wrong. So in having these strict rules about a very straightforward storytelling device of simple panels, just these two colors of blue, then when something shifts and changes, it tells the reader subliminally something's not right here.
Right.
So it's a case of less is more.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm only using a little bit of color, but with those little bit of colors and a little bit of adjustments, by being consistent elsewhere, when those things happen, it's like this aha moment where
Right.
it tells the reader something is different now.
Right. The effect can be lost if you're not doing it that way.
Yeah, if you're using it all the time,
Yep.
sort of the splash page thing, or any like breaking out of a panel, the panel's been crushed, just somebody's flying out of it. That doesn't matter if you do it 3 or 4 times in a fight scene. It just doesn't have a meaning
Right.
anymore.
And with those effects and with that blue, I noticed you're doing, like you said, some rough edges on some clean, sharp edges on others. You're using this kind of gradated or blurred effect occasionally,
Yeah.
and then you're stretching uh, some the look of the character. You're distorting the look of the character to show their inner state of mind. There's just a lot of great visual tricks you're doing here that all get across to us what's happening emotionally and physically with the characters and telling the story clearly. It's really nice.
No, thanks so much. Thanks. And again, a lot of these are just lessons that you learn from well, we're specifically talking about Toth, so he did so much of that kind of thing of setting a mood. He was a cinematographer. I mean, he's one of these kind of guys you'd think of as there are some people just kind of know a little bit about everything. And I don't
Mhm.
know if he was like that in the rest of his life, but when it came to like art and production, storytelling, whether it was on a film or animation, like you just read those animation instructions that he writes out. Like,
Mhm.
no wonder he blew up at people. He was so good and so deeply knowledgeable of what he did. It had to be frustrating when people are just, coming up short.
Yeah, and that's a good portion of his whole career, really. I'm sure
Yeah.
he blew up sometimes just because he was a temperamental dude, but other times uh, he would tear up pages, walk away, blow up, whatever. He'd always come back and then get back to work.
Yeah, when you put that much time and love into and take your industry so seriously as he did, we know through our own experiences and reading about the history of comics, there are plenty of people who didn't. They either came through as artists because they had the talent but not the drive, and they just get by, or publishers who really didn't care, production people who didn't care.
Right.
Um, Especially if it was like a simple thing that he knew would make a huge difference, like the way a color process worked or the printing worked, and to know that with the smallest amount of effort on this other part of the team, it would make the process that much better, and there would be refusals to do it. I could get why you would like lose your freaking mind sometimes.
No doubt some of that was budgetary constraints, but some of it was just not having the talent to back it up, um, to support what he had done. Otherwise, we were talking about storytelling and solid storytelling, either with your stuff or with Totes. I noticed online that you had done an updated version of the Wally Woods 22 panels that always work. I I
Hmm.
I really hesitate to show that to students because I don't want them thinking that way at all, because it's kind of a cynical
Yeah.
thing. It's really helpful stuff, but it is kind of like
Yeah.
when the writer screws up or gives you too much dialogue or whatever else. Here are the ways, and but there's a bunch of different ways to approach panels and storytelling that really help on that page, and that you've buttressed with your powers update. What's your take on that page?
um yeah, you're right. Those shots, like you have, they're a great sort of crib note thing,
Right.
especially when you first start out, just to remind you that you can do these different things. Knowing when to use them is more important than using them, I think,
Yep.
because like if you have a scene where it's supposed to be intimate and two people are caring about each other, but you're doing the shot through, say, a naked tree with a bunch of jagged branches going through a looking through a window, that feels very stalkery, and you're also pulling back away from the intimacy of that shot. So while the shot may work, it needs to be implemented, at the right time.
Right.
um, but I think that's easy enough to do. The mistake would to be looking at that and just thinking that it's like a Rolodex wheel of shots that always work and
That's my
every
fear.
time.
I want people to be thinking instinctively or solidly in terms of storytelling and composition and stuff, instead of just like, oh, I can do this one now and plug this one in here. Um, but
Yeah.
um, there's no doubt there's a lot of helpful info on there. But I think I'm going to continue to keep that from students for a bit.
Yeah, it's more of a graduation gift.
There you
Hey,
go.
here are these, here's one of these little crutches that work.
Right. Is there any particular Toth piece or story that you really like, or beyond black spotting, any other facet of his work that really stands out to you?
I mean, my favorite time of his is getting into like the 70s and stuff, where he was using that thin and then an extra thick line. And when you look at my work, I don't do that. It is one of my favorite things of Toth, but every time I've tried to imitate that, I've failed. It just doesn't look right. And then I look at like Chris Samney or Paul Azaceta, and I'm like, damn it, I can't do that. So that time period is my favorite, and one of my favorite sort of Toth books was the one that Dark Horse put out of like the creepy, um, the creepy collection of stories.
Right.
So it's not so much a specific story as much as there's that time period, that sort of 60s and 70s time period. That's my favorite of his.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've got that creepy book. I wish the reproduction was a little bit better because some of the subtleties of tone get lost too.
Scans.
But I'm really glad that to have it
Yeah.
all in one place though.
I will say though, like my favorite, truly my favorite story would be, and it's weird because it's not really a story. It's the Dancing Man, the tap dance story.
Yeah,
It's just pure storytelling. There's no background or anything, but there's an arc, there's a range of emotions, there's expression. There's more in that than I've seen in most comics. Even comics that I like, there's still more in that little expression of like, what can I do with a silent man dancing? Is it's just, it's bombastic. It's subtle and bombastic at the same time.
it
It's
is.
just
It
one of the
is.
best pieces of storytelling ever.
It's one of my faves, and it I included that in, I think, the second episode of this program,
Mm-hmm.
and went into it just a little bit. Um, there's a lot more going on there in regards to how he reacted to Russ Manning and Wally Wood's deaths, and how readers, fans, consumers take in or reject artists' work, and his own
Yeah,
impending demise. That was going to come
yeah.
sometime down the line, but there's a lot going on in that story, and then it's just a fun guy dancing on top of it.
Wow. I didn't realize that was like the origin of it.
Yeah, I think it's on the pages itself, dedicated to Manning and Wood, who had just passed at the
Mm,
time he drew it. Um,
wow.
yeah,
I had a letter writing thing with Alex near the end.
you did.
And yeah,
It's in the
it
early
was really good. It
2000s.
was a great. And the thing that bummed me out was when he died. Like I knew he went to the hospital, and I knew he was getting tons of letters and stuff from people, and I was like, I'm gonna write him, say like a week after he gets back, because I know things will get quiet and you're alone while you're recovering, right? And
Mhm.
there'll be less letters and stuff. So I wanted to wait a little bit. And unfortunately, he passed not much longer afterwards, so I didn't
Yeah.
get to send that sort of last letter. And even then, I wouldn't even thought of it as the last letter. It was just, he liked writing to people, and it was always a blessing to get a response back. And um, my experience with him writing wise was always good. Like he was
Yeah.
cheerful. He had nothing but positivity in there. Um, he never. It's funny. I have a letter where he complimented my work to somebody else, but he never told me anything like that directly, which was pretty cool because his letters were always instructional. Right? It wasn't about either building up my ego or tearing it down or giving me compliments or not. He was so in love with the art form itself. That's what the letters were about, from the front to the very back.
Right.
He would be talking about like expressive lines and this artist and how this person does this and how you should look into film because of this. And like every letter was like that. It was just full of such a passion and positivity for the work. Yeah, it was just amazing. I still have the letters, and I'll see if I could dig them up for you. Maybe we'll put them up sometime.
Oh, I'd be happy to help any way I can with that, and or put them on the Instagram page or whatever else. There's different things that
Yeah,
I've got in mind too. We'll see how things go forward. I can tell you more about that another time. That's great to hear that you had a good experience with that, and
yeah.
I'm really pleased for you in that regard, because that's the opposite of what some people, the experiences they had with them. So I'm glad that you had a good one.
Yeah, me too. And I knew going in that he is quote a curmudgeon, so if he did, get upset. Actually, he did tell me stop drawing shovel heads because I was I was so
So you got a little
Bruce
something.
Timm influence. Yeah, he was like, stop with the shovel heads, kid. I don't know if that's what he sounded like,
That's funny.
but
There you go. Good advice for
yeah.
everybody. Stop drawing the shovel head.
Which
Thanks
I
again.
still do. I've made a living off of it.
There you go. It's worked out. Thanks again for taking time, Mike. You've got Blue Book is out. Chapters are being released now and are available,
Yeah.
and they're on Substack. And you're doing what, like 10-page chapters every 2 weeks?
Yeah, 10-page chapters every 2 weeks. The first one's free. There's a subscription after the first chapter. But if you're into weird stuff, James is posting a whole lot of material that just besides Blue Book is in that field. And obviously, if you're a fan of James Tinian, you'd want to subscribe. But we'll eventually also publish this as well. We're just concentrating on this format first,
Any idea
and
how
then it'll
long
go to
this
print
whole
sometime.
piece will be when it's printed?
The first one will be 80 pages. The Betty and Barney Hill story will be
Okay.
80 pages in total, and I'm like 20 or 30 into it so far. So
And World of
almost
Krypton
halfway.
is going to be released later this year.
Yeah, I don't know what month it comes out, but I'm guessing either towards the end of the year or the very beginning of next. And I promote the crap out of all this stuff on all my social media feeds, which is usually just at Oeming, so it'd be pretty easy to find.
God, so everybody follow Michael's stuff and where he is on social media for details about that stuff coming out, and make sure to track his Patreon page too, because he's got some new stuff coming out there soon.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, man.
That's all the time we're giving to this episode. This again is Paul Fricke for the Alex Toth In Depth program. Remember what Toth said: edit your art continuously at every stage. Save work. Until next time, go with Toth.